Hello and welcome to the second video in our lecture on access control policies and mechanisms. Remember that a security policy is a statement of who is allowed to access what asset and under what circumstances and with which access rights. So in this video, instead of discussing specific access control policies, I want to describe four different types of such policies. The first one is called the discretionary access control policy, or DAC. So in this category, the access control is based on the identity of who is asking for access to the resource. And the authorization rules are basically decided by the owner of that resource. So it's called the discretionary access control mechanism because the access control rules are at the discretion of the owner. The owner of the resource can decide who they give access to that resource and with which specific rights. So a completely different kind of access control policy is called a mandatory access control, or MAC, not to be confused with the message authentication code. So in this particular case, the access control is decided based on security labels and security clearances. So in such a system, every resource has a security label. Like a document or a file could be labeled as confidential or secret or top secret. And then the users have security clearances that allow them to access different resources with different labels. So in this case, again, the access control is based on a match between the labels and the clearances. And the reason this is called a mandatory access control policy is because the only way that you can get access to a resource is if you had enough clearance to access that resource. But the owner of that resource is not going to be allowed to give you access if you don't have the clearance. So it's the opposite of a discretionary access control in that sense. Then a third kind of access control policy is called the role-based access control. So it's actually based on the role that the user is playing, either in the company or within, within a software development team. So there could be a role for a basic developer, there could be a role for a team leader or for a manager. And for each one of these roles, the access rights are going to be different. So this is called the role-based access control. That is, it's not so much tied to the identity of the user, but more to their role, and not so much tied to the owner of the resource either. And then the last kind of access control policy I want to mention is the ABAC, or attribute-based access control. So this is a kind of policy that is much more fine-grained, where access control is based on different attributes of the user and of the assets, of the resource, and also of the environment. So it could be very fine-grained. Basically, whether you get access to a resource could depend on, say, your IP address or your geographical location or the time of day and so on and so forth. Any kind of attribute you can imagine could be used in an ABAC type policy. So before we dive into more specific examples, let's define some terminology, in particular the difference between subjects and objects. So in the case of access control policies, a subject is any entity that is trying to access a resource. So in general, you would think of a subject as a user of the system, and that's definitely possible. But more generally, any user is trying to access a resource like a file through a program, through an application. So every program that runs is called a process, and so typically a user is represented by the process, and the process is the subject. It's the entity that is trying to get access to a resource. So typically a subject is held accountable for their actions. So there is usually a log or an audit trail of which actions the subject has taken. And in general, there are three classes of subjects in current systems that you may be familiar with. One is the owner. So the owner is the person who owns the file or created the file. If it's a system resource, then the owner might be a system administrator. And if we're talking about a project type resource, then the owner of that resource might be the project manager or administrator or team leader. So this is the lower level, if you wish, of a subject, is a single person or entity that owns that resource. And then we can talk about a group subject. So, in a case of, say, a software project where several people contribute to a single software project, then they could be given group access rights. So, these are access rights that are shared by everybody that belong to that group, but by nobody outside of the group. So, membership in the group is the crucial factor that decides whether you can access a resource or not, as opposed to whether you're the owner of the resource or not. And finally, there is a third category of subject called the world or the outside world. And so this is everybody else, everybody who's not either an owner of the resource or belongs to a group that has access to that resource. So this is typically the type of subject where we give the least amount of access. And this might be people from the outside world trying to break into, for example, or just regular users who just don't have access to those resources. So subject must be contrasted with objects. So again, the subjects are the entities that are trying to access the resources, where the object are the resources themselves. So an object is basically an entity that contains information or is able to provide a service that the subject is trying to get access to or to use. So there are many examples of objects or resources, as we've already discussed many times. So typical kinds of resources would be application programs or data files, but it could also be something a little bit more specific, like messages or mailboxes in a mail system, or say in a memory system, it could be a page or a segment. It could be a record in a database, or it could be just a bunch of bytes or a bunch of words in a Word document. But it could also go as far as including hardware such as processors and ports to communicate with the outside world, or clocks and even nodes in a network. This could be considered objects because they are assets to be protected against attackers, but also other subjects who may not have access to them according to the policy. So the number and type of objects that are covered by the security policy, the access control policy in particular, could vary a lot from organization to organization. But the bottom line is that it could be a huge number if you go down to the level of files and directories and bytes and so on. So of course, there's a trade-off between the fine-grained level of control you want and the highest security possible, and also the processing burden of maintaining and enforcing all of these rules. So on one side, we have the subjects. These are the users or processes that are trying to access the resources. And then on the other side, we have the resources themselves, which we call the objects. And then the thing that's going to connect these subjects with the objects are the access rights themselves. These are the entities that describe in which way a particular object is allowed to access or not allowed to access a particular object. So we have different kind of access rights that you're very familiar with from your use of, say, file systems in your favorite operating system. So kind of an access right is called the read access right, where the user is access to read or obtain information from a particular resource, but is not allowed to do anything other than reading it. So whether it's a file or a table in a database or record in a particular table. And then you have the write access file, which, as the name indicates, means that the subject is allowed to modify or add new information to a particular object. So typically, a write access file involves or includes a read access file, since it's sometimes really hard to modify or add new data if you can't read what's already in there. Then you have the execute access right, which has to do with the ability to executing a program or running an executable file. Notice that you could have an execute access right without having a write access right, because you may not be able to modify the file, but you can still execute it. And you may also not have a read access right, because even though you're allowed to execute a program, you may not be allowed to look at its code, or at least its source code. And then we have some more accessory access rights like delete rights, create rights, and search rights that are pretty self-explanatory. So the delete right is just the right to literally delete the resource altogether. The create right is the ability to create, say, a new file or to insert a new record in a database table. And then the search right is the ability to perform a search through a resource that contains a lot of information. So most common example would be to do a search through a directory. Another example would be to do a query in a database. So this is a broad overview of the terminology and the types of access or access control policies. And in the rest of this lecture, we're going to be going into a little bit more detail about more specific policies.